The day was the 16th of August 2012. It was around the area of Lonmin Mine in Marikana. That day was not supposed to be a day of bloodshed. It was supposed to be a day where the workers could finally walk out smiling. The negotiations should have been smooth, but unfortunately it did not happen that way. What had happened was miners, breadwinners, people who fend for their families had lost their lives at the hands of police. And it was a day that will never be forgotten in our democratic South Africa. It's a day that lives on in the memory of so many of us. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Good afternoon and welcome to yet another edition of Truth to Power. On this edition, we are going to be speaking about the Marikana massacre. A massacre that continues to haunt so many families in that area. A massacre that continues to have a light casted over South Africa and what more should have been done in order to make sure it never happened. So my guest today to discuss the Marikana massacre 8 years on from that disastrous day, I have with me Judge Ian Farlam, who was the chairperson of the Farlam Commission of Inquiry, and of course Joseph Matunjwa, Mr. Joseph Matunjwa, who is the president of AMCU. Now it is worth noting that we did send an invite through to one of the officials of Sibanye-Stillwater, who of course purchased the majority stake of Lonmin Mines. Unfortunately, they were not able to make it as they have other activities to attend to. It's also worth noting that through our current president, Cyril Ramaphosa, who was the then deputy president of the ANC and the country, through his company Shanduka, which had interests in Lonmin Mine. He was, of course, a non-executive director at the time. And through a series of phone calls leading up to the 16th of August, it is sad to say that the words that were exchanged between security forces and President Cyril Ramaphosa was not that pleasant. But of course, he was exonerated, and of course, through Judge Ian Farlam, we are going to be speaking about it. So let me bring our guests into the studio. Gentlemen, good afternoon, and thank you so much for joining us on Truth to Power.
Good afternoon, Mr. Patel, and good afternoon to the viewers.
No, it's an absolute pleasure. And also, no, it's an absolute pleasure having you, Judge Farlam and Mr. Matunjwa. First question I want to ask you, gents, is, of course, looking at the week, Lonmin rakes in tremendous profits. There's no running away from that. Why did it have to come to a point where a strike was needed in order for the workers to demand the minimum wage of 12,500, and why was it being ignored by the board? I'm going to start off with you, Mr. Matunjwa.
Thank you and good afternoon, and good afternoon again to Judge Mr. Farlam. I think the reason for the strike to go on, one of the factors was about the continuation of the wage structural formation that was meant for the majority of black workers in the mining sector, of which even after the dispensation, the political dispensation of 1994, it has never delivered a desired livelihood to the majority of the mine workers. And secondly, one would also say that even the representative trade union at that point never took their members serious when they were calling for a better living wage, hence resulted into them taking the full bargaining processes on their hands.
Judge Farlam, I want to take the same question through to you.
Well, the position was that there was a 2-year wage agreement in force, which was due to come to an end, I think, in 2013. And so the Lonmin people took the attitude, we've got a 2-year agreement, you can't depart from it, it's binding for the 2-year period, and you can't strike during that period either. There was a problem about that because in the past, when circumstances had changed quite dramatically, as I'll explain in a moment, circumstances had changed dramatically in the platinum industry at that stage. Despite a binding agreement of that kind, the employer and the union had further discussions. They refused to apply that in this particular case. The circumstances changed because Implats, Impala Platinum, had also had a similar 2-year agreement. They had received demands from some of their workers for an increase. There had been an unprotected strike with a lot of violence and intimidation, and they eventually agreed to give an increase to the workers. Obviously, the Impala people, the Impala workers spoke to the Lonmin workers, told them what had happened, and they obviously expected that something similar was available for them. They raised the matter with the senior people at Lonmin with the response that I mentioned. We got a 2-year agreement, it's binding, that's it. And that led to the problems.
Mr. Matunjwa, of course, the Wildcat strike had started on August the 10th and was, of course, the start of what would be a week that the country would not forget. What role did AMCU try and play to make sure that there could be no bloodshed that could have been left in there? What was the role of you, Mr. Matunjwa, and of course the rest of your organization in making sure and saying, right, let's try and find an amicable way of making sure we do not come to the point that happened on August the 16th?
Yes, I think one will recall that AMCO was not a bargaining union at a point in time. We were just represented at Career, of which it was a limited organizational right that we have. So therefore, AMCO had no leg or local stand to sit in the bargaining forum. So it was the National Union of Mine Workers by that time. So even when the strike started, we were not involved by management. Management called us very late, of which we responded to them to say they need to engage the workers and channel them through the forum where with their union, where they can look at what are the challenges, what are the demands of the workers. But they shouldn't shun the workers away from, since they are already raising these issues, of which we as AMCO, we had no right to negotiate for any conditions of employment at that time.
Judge Farlam, I want to come to you. In the report that was, of course, published, it was stated that both AMCO and NUM had tried to convince the workers not to continue the strike, which, of course, would have led to bloodshed, which inevitably did happen. Would you feel that it was a lack of conviction from the workers, or did everyone try to do their best in making sure that what we saw on August the 16th would not happen?
Well, certainly the head of NUM also addressed the workers on the afternoon of the 15th, and he tried to persuade them to leave the Kopi, and they didn't really pay any attention to what he said. There was a problem there, I think, because the NUM representatives at Lonmin had been advising the workers there's nothing they could do, and been opposing the strike. And so any spokesman for NUM didn't get a favorable reception. Mr. Matunjwa took a different line. He suggested that they effectively leave the Kopi and and go to the CCMA and then have a protected strike. It was getting dark at that stage. This is on the late afternoon of the 15th, and he said he'd come back the next morning at 9 o'clock. According to the evidence, he was quite confident that he could persuade them to accept his advice, and he told the generals that. The next morning, for reasons we don't have to go into, he didn't go back at 9 o'clock. Eventually, at 12 o'clock, the provincial commissioner said to him, "You've got to go to the Koppie. Why haven't you gone?" He promised to go. He said he had problems with Lonman. She said, "I'm not interested in that. You've got to go." So eventually he went. He spoke to them. And in the end, in fact, he went twice. He went back to Lonman, and then back to the Koppie. And eventually, they wouldn't take his advice, and he perceived that the police were in a mood to move to the tactical option, and there was in all probability going to be bloodshed. And he went down on bended knees and pleaded with them to leave, to take his advice. That was something that we regarded as very commendable, because by doing that, he was effectively taking a line which might meet with disfavor from the workers. But never mind that, he showed his strength of character. And as I said, he went so far as to go onto his bended knees to plead with them to leave. And they said, "No, we won't leave." Some of them appeared to have been confident that if there was police fire, it wouldn't hurt them. There was a whole lot of evidence about people who'd been taking muti, and possible belief that some of them at least may have thought that the bullets would turn to water. Now, we weren't able to make a definite finding on that. But what we do know is when he pleaded with them to go, and he said they would be killed if they didn't, they said, "No, we will stand here and we will not go." But what then happened, of course, was what we all know, that in the end, 33 mine workers were killed. Everyone talks about 34, but the 34th was not even an employee of Lonman. He was a family member who went to take lunch to his uncle, who was one of the strikers. But he was just walking past, about 250 meters away from the place where the fatal shots were fired, and he was killed as well.
And of course, somebody being caught in the crossfire is never a great aspect of what had happened on that tragic day. Mr. Matunjwa, the days leading up to, of course, August the 16th, and you did speak about, of course, trying to convince the workers not to go to the strike. But talk to us about any negotiations with Lonman at the time, and why weren't they able to produce the wage request at such a volatile time, but also at a time where this was a mine that was making profits during that period leading up to 2012. There's no denying that. And it's not just because we have so much of resources or platinum resources in our country. It's because of the fact that this is a company that finds a way of making profits. So why couldn't they at least settle on that negotiation of 12,500 for the workers?
Yes, it is quite difficult really to say what was the reason, except to say they believe on the apartheid wage structure, of which was making for them huge profits, super profits, and then it has never been challenged. And even the trade union representative, they've never saw any difficulty on a CPI increment based on the low wage. And in these instances, then it becoming very difficult. And then furthermore, Lonmin becoming hot-headed because they had a connection within the government, political parties, who's the ruling party, of which the deputy president of the NC, which the deputy of the Republic by then, had some interest, in the very same mine. So you could see clearly Lonmin took that hard decision to say, in as much as their workers are crying for better wage, better conditions of employment, but they relied on their connection. That's how simple I can justify the reason of Lonmin not want to budge in workers' demands, irrespective that there were a 2-year agreement, but the company was doing very well in the previous boom of 2005. I think we've got research papers from Wits University, SWAP, to say Lonmin could have been paid even more than 12,500 by then.
Judge Fowler, as Mr. Matunja spoke about the interest that the then Deputy President of the ANC and the Republic of South Africa, President Cyril Ramaphosa, had within Lonmin through Shanduka. Now, the Commission, of course, did acquit Mr. Ramaphosa, Susan Shabangu, who was the then Minister of Mineral Resources, and the then Minister of Police, Mr. Nathi Mthethwa. Now, the finding, of course, and the acquittal had raised eyebrows, especially in the community of Marikana, who felt at the time justice was not being served. Right now, judged by the evidence that the Commission found and the Commission based it on, does the Commission still back the acquittal of these three members of Cabinet and, of course, Deputy President Cyril Ramaphosa at the time?
Yes, well, the point I want to make first is that Mr. Ramaphosa was not yet the Deputy President of South Africa. He was simply a member of the NEC of the ANC. He was, through Shanduka, a substantial shareholder in Lonmin, as Mr. Matunja has correctly said. The question that we had to investigate was whether he was in any way involved in inciting, as it were, that's the correct word, or urging the police to take the totally inappropriate measures that they did on the 16th of August. And we heard detailed evidence from him and from Minister Shabangu and from Minister Mthethwa, and we were unable to find on the evidence that there was any connection between anything Mr. Ramaphosa had said and the actions that took place. What happened was Mr. Ramaphosa spoke to Minister Shabangu on the 15th of August in Cape Town. He asked her to send a message to the Minister of Police that the police must act, the phrase he used, I think, was in a more pointed way. And in a private communication with one of his co-directors at Lonmin, he said that what was happening was criminal and that concomitant action was required. Now, what was happening was criminal. People were being murdered. This was an unprotected strike, which was attempts were being made by certainly by some of the strikers to enforce the strike by violence and intimidation. And there were a number of people who were murdered simply because they had the temerity to go to work. There were other people who were security officers of Lonmin who were also murdered in terrible circumstances on the previous Sunday. One of them was a Muslim gentleman who had a portion of his tongue cut out by the people who murdered him. And we found that was in order to obtain muti. So Mr. Ramaphosa explained that he was concerned about the ongoing violence, concerned about the people who were being killed, and he wanted the police to take what he regarded as the appropriate action. Concomitant simply means appropriate. The appropriate action to prevent the killings. That was his evidence. He conveyed this to Susan Shabangu, as I've explained. The evidence was that she didn't pass the message on to the Minister of Police. We had evidence of their cell phones and so forth. The Minister of Police was away investigating or inspecting police stations in KwaZulu-Natal, and the evidence was that he never got the message from Mr. Ramaphosa. It wasn't passed on by Minister Shabangu. So there was no basis for finding that what Mr. Ramaphosa had said to Minister Shabangu there was any causal connection between it and the massacre which took place on the 16th. And this is a point I'd like to make. We had excellent evidence leaders. The two leaders were brilliant human rights lawyers in South Africa. Every attempt was made to get all the relevant information on this point. And it just wasn't evidence to make a finding. And as I've said, the evidence was as I've summarized it. After the commission was over, I had an interview off the record with one of the journalists, one of the broadcast journalists, who said to me that she didn't realize at the time that you could only make a finding if you had evidence to support it. She said, "I'm sorry, I didn't know that when I was in front of the microphone." And every single finding we made in our report was based on evidence that we heard. And there was a footnote giving the reference to the evidence. And I dealt with that part myself. I went into all the evidence that was led in respect of allegations against Mr. Ramaphosa, Minister Shibangu, and Mr. Mtetwa. And I did not see that there was any way possible to make a finding that Mr. Ramaphosa was guilty of murder, as Mr. Malema has alleged. It was on that basis that we gave the finding we did. But I must say something else. Minister Shibangu, she didn't play any real role at all. She didn't pass the message on. She'd initially made a statement saying it wasn't a criminal matter, it was just a matter calling for negotiation, a labor relations matter. She later admitted that that was wrong, because clearly it was wrong. There were dead bodies on the ground at the time. But as far as Minister Mtetwa was concerned, the evidence was a little bit equivocal. There wasn't enough to make a definite finding against him. But equally, there wasn't enough evidence to make a definite finding in his favor. And though when President Zuma had a press conference and explained what findings we had made, although he said that we'd cleared Mr. Mtetwa, that wasn't correct. We gave an open verdict saying it was not possible on the evidence to make a finding one way or the other. I think that's the answer to the question you asked me.
Before we go to the break, Mr. Matunja, just your outcomes with regards to the Phylum Commission. I know that you were heavily involved during the time when the commission was established by then President Jacob Zuma. So just your reaction to it, and just what can you take out from it with regards to any sort of justice that could be given to the families of those who were slain on that day?
I think what one should say, or one would ask, what was the objective of the commission? Was the setting up of the commission was to seek the truth, or was to absolve the politicians, or to criminalize workers, or to protect the status quo? Those are the questions that one should really ask. I mean, as you will know that on the 15th, if I'm not mistaken, I think Honorable Judge Phylum will assist me. There were meetings that were held by the SEPs, of which they coined it a D-Day, whereby a number of mortuary vans were ordered, and about 4,000 rounds of ammunition were ordered. And furthermore, if my memory serves me well, there was a witness expert of the SEPs, which was from Netherlands, somewhere around there, who put it very clearly that this decision of the police taking this path of killing workers, it couldn't be just a person without any influence. This was a merely political decision, a person who's got a political power. That was a witness of the SEPs. So therefore, to suggest that political connection was not there and influence, I find it very strange where I'm seated. Hence, I was listening when this evidence was led. Even though one cannot say we condone that people should be killed and what, yes, law enforcement must take its place. But the question is, if, for instance, the workers at scene 1 were criminals, the question will be, at scene 2, what were they? They were still criminals, those workers. Because the commission where I was looking, if my memory serves me, was following the theory of the police that they were shooting workers on self-defense, of which, if we are pausing for a moment and say, yes, they were in self-defense in scene 1, the question will be, in scene 2, what were they doing? Was it still a self-defense? What prompted all these helicopters, horses, running after the people who raised their hand on the air, pleading for their life, but still were gunned down? And the one worker who was shot when crossing the river which was about more than 500, whatever, 600 meters away, and he was shot at the back, was still the self-defense. So these are the kind of things that if we want to heal the nation, the truth must be told. I don't believe much that we had enough time, because I think was financial constraint. If you'll remember, even the current sitting president, he never had enough time to be cross-examined, as compared to many of us who spent days and days in that hot seat, Magidiwana, myself, and others. But when it comes to the current sitting president, it was only one day, if I'm not mistaken, or 2 days minimum, and people were given limited time, to cross-examine it. But to come to the conclusion, really, to say there was no political interference or any otherwise persuasion leading to the massacre is still a question, deep question to be answered, really.
Judge, you had your hand up. Do you want to intervene just
I'd
before
like to answer
Yes,
to those
yes.
points. I'm glad Mr. Matundu raised them, because I know they are views held by lots of people, and they are based to some extent on a misconception. But let me first of all, you asked me, what was the commission all about? Well, we had a slogan for the commission on the cover of the report: truth, restoration, and justice. That's what we were about. We were there to find the truth. And we did our best to find the truth. And I'm afraid I'll have to take a bit of time to answer the question properly. But that's what it was about. And we were given the power to refer certain inquiries to other bodies. One of the matters we decided to refer to another body was the question of the criminal liability of individual members of the police service, because that in itself was a long, complicated thing. There were lots of people who'd fired, and we would have been sitting for several more years if we'd had to do that. But there's another problem about that. Under the regulations of the commission, evidence that members of the police gave to us couldn't be used against them in a subsequent trial. So it seemed to us to be an exercise almost in futility, certainly to some extent, to get a policeman in the box, cross-examine him up and down as to how many shots he fired, whether he exceeded the bounds of self-defense, and so forth. And then none of that evidence could be used against him in a trial. And the Director of Public Prosecutions would have said to me, well, thank you for saying I should prosecute this person, but what evidence have I got? The only evidence I've got is the evidence he gave himself. So we said that we thought.
I think we seem to have lost Judge Farlam there, but we are going to be taking a break. And after the break, we'll, of course, be delving in. It's 8 years remembering the tragedy that was Marikana. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Truth to Power. I am joined by Judge Ian Farlam and Joseph Matunjwa as we are discussing 8 years on from the Marikana massacre. Judge Farlam, I know we lost you there. Of course, with all these new apps and new technologies, sometimes getting lost in translation always happens. So please do continue. You were responding to what Mr. Matunjwa had said earlier on.
Yes, I was explaining that the investigation as to which members of the police force were criminally liable was one that we passed over to the provincial director of public prosecution to take further, so that he could get admissible evidence which could form the evidence in a prosecution. We didn't think for a moment that there would be a situation where we sit 8 years later and no one's ever been charged. But that's not something for which we can be held responsible. What we did was we tried to find out the facts. And in the report, there's a narrative which covers the whole period from Thursday, the 9th of August, up until what happened on the 16th and thereafter. What had happened, very briefly, was there were murders. There were a number of people killed before the fatal day of the 16th. And the evidence was the police tried, the international policing experts agreed the police had a difficult task to try to restore order. There were, at various times, there were something like 4,000 people on the kopje, 4,000 strikers, many of them armed with assegais and pangas and other dangerous weapons, and the police had a difficult job. They tried to deal with it appropriately. They first of all brought in police negotiators to speak to the strikers, but they couldn't persuade the strikers to leave the Koppie. And to some extent, you can't blame the negotiators for that, because they got no cooperation from Lonmin. The strikers wanted to talk to Lonmin. The Lonmin people didn't want to come to the Koppie. Originally, the strikers said you must come to the Koppie. Lonmin understandably said we're not prepared to go to the Koppie because there was a danger they could be killed. But they weren't either prepared to go to a neutral territory where there's no question of their safety being in danger. And so it was very difficult for the negotiators to persuade the strikers to leave the Koppie because they had nothing to offer them. What they wanted, which was a perfectly reasonable request, was an opportunity to negotiate with the people at London. That was not available. So that's an important fact to remember. What they then decided to do was to get because they heard, according to the information, I think about a third of the people on the Koppie were members of NUM, another third were members of AMCU, and I think the others weren't members of any union at all. So they thought a sensible thing to do was to get the leaders of the two trade unions to come and address the strikers and persuade them to leave the Koppie. There was a radio program on SAFM called The Forum at 8 on the Wednesday morning, at which Mr. Mthunzwa was one of the speakers, and there's a representative from NUM as well. And the compere of the program urged them to go to Marikana and to speak to the strikers, and they accepted the invitation. I think, to be fair, Mr. Mthunzwa accepted it immediately, and I think NUM took a bit of time, but they did accept it, and they went. And as I've said, the head of NUM, Mr. Zukwana, got nowhere in speaking to them, and Mr. Mthunzwa did speak to them. But on as I also said earlier, the matter stood over till the following morning. Mr. Mthunzwa had promised to go back at 9 o'clock. For various reasons, he didn't. And by 12 o'clock, the provincial commissioner said to him, "You've got to go. You promised to go." And he said, "But I'm having problems with Lonmin." She said, "I'm not interested in that. You've got to go." And he went. But Mr. Mthunzwa referred to what happened on the previous evening, the Wednesday evening. There was a meeting of the National Management Forum of the police, which we were not told about initially, despite the fact the police promised to give us all the relevant information. And at that meeting, which was attended by the National Commissioner, all the deputy commissioners of the police, and the provincial commissioners, including, of course, the provincial commissioner from the Northwest Province. And at that meeting, it was decided that the following day was going to be what was called D-Day. That was the day it was going to be ended. Now, that was extremely unfortunate and stupid, because the police had worked out a plan to deal with the situation if they couldn't get them off with their consent. The plan was accepted by the international experts as relatively risk-free. The plan was to put a fence around the Koppie at sunrise, when there were only a relatively small number of strikers on the Koppie. Most of the strikers used to go home every evening. Some of them, in fact, went home for lunch. And there was a smallish number, about 50, I think, who stayed on the Koppie. The plan was to put a fence around the Koppie, then go there, arrest the people who were behind the fence, and as other people came through, to sort of filter them. That was the expression, filter them through. That, as I say, was accepted as relatively risk-free. But of course, it could only work around about sunrise, because later on, all these other people would have come through, and there would be a number of about something like 4,000, and it was quite totally impossible to implement the plan then. So the direct consequence of the decision made on the Wednesday nights, that never mind anything else, this is going to finish tomorrow on Thursday. Thursday will be D-Day, was that the plan that they had, the safe plan they had, couldn't be implemented. And it was also clear that there was no way that they could have removed the people from the Koppie against their will in those circumstances without bloodshed. Their intelligence was there would be bloodshed, and in fact, they took that into account. That's proved by the fact that they ordered 4 hearses. They only got 1, as it happened, but they got asked for 4, And they asked, as Mr. Matunja pointed out, 4,000 extra bullets, which they didn't use. The brigadier actually sent them back, said we don't need them. But the fact is, that evidence proves beyond doubt that they foresaw violence. Now, so we wanted to know why this decision, which was totally unacceptable and very dangerous and reckless, why this decision was made. Now, on the evidence, there were 4 possible reasons, which I'll give you in a moment. But we tried really hard to find out whether all 4 operated, or just a number of them, or just only one, and if so, which one. The first possible reason was one that if you didn't know the facts, you wouldn't believe it could be so. But on the Tuesday afternoon, the provincial commissioner had a discussion with senior people from London, and she said, we've got to act tomorrow. By tomorrow, she meant Wednesday. We've got to bring this thing to an end on Wednesday. Why? Because Mr. Malema may come. You remember Mr. Malema diffused the situation at Impala Platz. And we can't have Mr. Malema coming and diffusing this situation. Now, if that was the reason, it's absolutely crazy. But that's what's the evidence. This is going to happen on Wednesday. It didn't happen because the peace negotiators were still busy. It would have been a breach of faith to ambush them, as it were, on the Wednesday morning. So the magistrate had to stand over till Thursday. Anyway, that was one reason. Whether that was conveyed to the National Management Forum, we don't know. There was a suggestion that the proceedings had been taped. We tried to get hold of the tape, and we were told, no, that part wasn't taped, but somehow the relevant tape was missing, and it was said that it had been lost, which was evidence which we greeted with some skepticism. The second possibility was this. We were given minutes of a meeting held at 6 o'clock that morning by the police on the Thursday morning. The minutes said nothing about it being D-Day. Suggestion was that they would negotiate, and if the situation escalated, they'd make a decision afterwards as to what was to be done. We would subsequently got the actual notes that were taken at the meeting, which told a slightly different story, that today is D-Day, that the phrase D-Day was in the minutes, and it's going to end today, whatever happens. At 9:30 that morning, the provincial commissioner gave a press conference with ETV, and she said, amongst other things, we hope that they will leave peacefully. The negotiations are on the go, but if they don't, they will be removed. I won't tell you how, but they will be removed, because we are going to break this strike today. So the possible reason, another second possible reason, was it was to break the strike. Now that's also totally unacceptable. If there's a labor dispute between employer and employee, that's a matter. It wasn't illegal. It was an unprotected strike. There'd be certain consequences for that, but it's not a matter for the police to interfere. So if that was the reason, you can understand why they didn't tell us that. But of course, it was totally unacceptable. The third reason was when Mr. Matunja was spoken to at about noon by the provincial commissioner and told it's his duty to go, he must speak to the people. She said to him, "This thing is costing too much money." Now, again, that wasn't a reason to embark upon this crazy plan, which actually shocked the expert from Northern Ireland. He said when he read this, he was actually shocked. He was a very experienced public order policeman. But in any event, the evidence was that she'd budgeted for the whole week for the operation, not just that it had to end on Thursday. And the fourth reason was suggested by the Dutch expert to whom Mr. Matunja referred, Mr. de Rover. He said that he thought that there must have been some political influence. He had no reason to, there's nothing concrete that he could rely on. He discussed it with two of the generals who said they thought he was right, but they also, was nothing they could have. They had no direct knowledge of that. So it was speculation. It was because of that evidence, of course, that we said there was no direct evidence of it. And that we said we were not able to make a definite finding against Mr. Mtetwa, but we equally, as I've said, weren't prepared to make a finding in his favor. So but what we did do, so the big question we asked was, why Thursday? Because it was quite clear that the reason was an unsatisfactory one, or there may be a number of reasons, all of them unsatisfactory, but we couldn't find what it was. And we were led, we weren't given proper answers by those who testified about that national meeting, which management forum meeting, which, as I said, we weren't told about. But afterwards, as the commission was nearly coming to an end, I drew up a questionnaire, sent it to all the people who'd been at that meeting, and said, would they please answer the questions I'd posed on affidavits. And we got affidavits. Two people who had now since left the police, they didn't respond. The others did, and we got the most evasive, unsatisfactory affidavits that you can imagine. But quite clearly, the answer is a sinister one, which they weren't prepared to give us. But what we did do, and this was also important, I'm sorry to give such a long answer, but Mr. Tunja made a number of points. There were, as he points out, there were two scenes. Scene one, near the small kraal, scene two at what is known as Copy 3. The evidence was such that threats had been made during the day by the strikers that they would kill some of the police. And when they finally moved towards the police, they were waving assegais and pangas and so forth. A shot was fired by one of the strikers, and the police we found, and the evidence leaders agreed that the police could reasonably have believed that they were under attack. They didn't think they were actually under attack. They thought the strikers were just going back to the informal settlement. But it was a reasonable belief on the part of the police that they were being attacked or going to be attacked. So they were entitled to act in self-defense. The evidence indicated that many of them exceeded the bounds of self-defense. Who they were, which ones had done that, was a matter which we assumed that the Director of Public Prosecutions would ascertain in the course of his investigations. But what happened thereafter was, I'm sorry to have to go to length, but it's necessary to understand it. A number of strikers were approaching. There were a number of police with water cannon and stun grenades at the side. And when some of the strikers had already passed the water cannon and stun grenade people, they finally fired the water from the water cannon and fired off stun grenades. That pushed those who had passed the police forward towards the police who were waiting. They thought they were being rushed. They were rushing at them, and that was when they fired, and they killed 17 people. One of whom, as I said, wasn't the striker. He was a family member who was about 250 meters away. The others behind the water cannon and the stun grenades turned around and ran away to Copy 3. And as Mr. Matunja correctly says, the police who fired there was no question of self-defense. There was terrible confusion. There was no control. And we, in fact, were strongly of the view that the whole operation should have been called off at the end of scene one. And we put that to the generals, and we got a very unsatisfactory answer. They said they would have done that, but they didn't know what had happened at scene one. That turned out to be totally untrue, because the evidence was they were listening on the radio, and it was quite clear on the radio that something terrible had happened. There were bullets being fired, people screaming and so on. So they knew very well that something had happened. So their reason for not stopping the operation was untrue. And at the end of it all, so we found that as far as what happened at scene two was concerned, it was totally unacceptable. As far as scene one was concerned, there was what is known as putative self-defense on the part of some of the strikers. But there was a further problem. And that was the police were using R5 rifles, assault rifles, which the experts all agreed was totally unsatisfactory, totally unacceptable for public order policing. But an R5 has got a particularly unfortunate aspect. The bullets that an R5 fires disintegrate when they hit the victim. So that meant it was impossible to prove who was killed by which striker was killed by which policeman, because it was not possible from ballistic evidence to identify who had fired the fatal shots. That might have created problems in respect of claims of the widows of people at scene one. But we found that the police were in any event liable on what was known as the McCann principle, because the planning was bad. It was quite clear from what I told you. The plan was hopeless. And on the McCann principle, which was accepted by the European Court of Human Rights, the police resisted the finding that it was part of our law, but we found it was part of our law. And on that principle, police put in a situation where they thought they had to defend themselves, but put in a situation they shouldn't have been in because of a bad plan, the government was liable. So I understand initially some of the families were very unhappy. They thought that we'd wasted everybody's time. We'd made no findings. One of the advocates said we'd made no findings at all. We decided nothing. Now that was untrue because we decided lots of things. But the key point we found was that the government were liable on the basis of this, even in respect of what happened at Scene 1, despite all the threats of murder of the police from some of the strikers. And the result was the government had to accept liability. And the only question thereafter was a question of quantum of damages. And I don't know what exactly has happened. I understand, at least as far as some of the claimants are concerned, that's still not settled. So 8 years later, the people have not yet got closure because the damages to which they're entitled haven't been paid. I understand there may be disputes as to the quantum, but there's surely ways of dealing with that. But certainly, you shouldn't have to wait 8 years. I know that's a long explanation. I'm sorry to have taken up so much time, but I think that's the answer that Mr. Matunja was entitled to receive, in light of the comments that he made.
Mr. Matunja, that was a very long answer from Judge Farlam, but of course just giving much more detail into it. Gentlemen, we are running out of time, but I want to come to you, Mr. Matunja. I just wanted to ask, what does Sibanye-Stillwater need to do in order to develop reconciliation along with government, especially that of President Cyril Ramaphosa, and quickly, just discuss the minimum wage and the achievement of it from an AMCU perspective?
Yes, thank you. I mean, with the commissioner, as the judge was explaining in details, but where we seated as AMCO, at least he could have found what Advocate Dalimpofi coined it as a toxic relation between the state and the capital. Even though that maybe, yes, the government was liable for everything, but loan mean, the evidence was before the commission that the loan mean provided a joke where all this massacre was discussed right at the workplace, of which we find it very strange. How was the capital hosting a state? Why the state never had its own place? Because they had, they are not West, they've got their police station, they've got whatever place that they could, but they came at the workplace where the workers were. That was very strange for us, of which that was a crucial evidence to say there was a toxic relation between the state and the capital. And secondly, as the Honorable Judge is saying, there was an element of politics. If they were saying they must rush to kill the strike or to destroy the strike or to stop the strike before Mr. Malema comes in, that's a political interference. There's an issue of politics. Who was saying those words? Getting from who? Surely those utterances or that narrative was coming from the politicians who are the ruling party at the end of the day, because they were in contestation of the constituency, because Malema was no longer much in good terms with the ruling party. So there was a political interference, and that political interference, it couldn't just come from the low rank, from the branches. And also for the police themselves, you remember the former commissioner, is Pierre, Mem Pierre, he had a drill in the morning where he was singing praises of the police, that they must look up, they mustn't be shy, or they mustn't be disappointed they were doing what they were told to do. So it's clear that this instruction was well thought. And for me to say, I promised the workers to come, yes, I promised, because they said, come tomorrow morning because it's at night. We cannot engage now. And then we went back to the joke and we engaged with the Mbembe, Naidu, and everyone, and the loan me. And the issue was very clear that I will meet 8 o'clock in the morning, of which I arrived at 8:20, if I could remember, because I was coming from Wheatbank. I was tired. I left the area almost midnight, only to find when I get to LPD, they delayed us, only to find the SEPs, Lonmin senior management, and the National Union of Mine Workers, they were holding a press conference. In that press conference, I think it's where then the D-Day was confirmed, of which AMCO was not part of it. Then later, when I requested a transport to transport me to the copy, as it was said that it is dangerous, you shouldn't use your own private vehicle, there was no transport provided for me. I asked, where is the NUM? NUM was nowhere to be found. We were on our own. And then Bombo was keep on saying, you promised the workers, you must go and tell them whatever for them to leave the copy. I said, but where is the transport? I've never promised anyone. The worker said, come the following morning. And furthermore, the same Mbombo, you remember he was busy with the light what? There was something of the ANC about the torch that was running provinces to provinces. So when I was asking, can you come to our assistance? Then he was nowhere to be found because he was on duty. And then I asked him, Mpembe, he said, Mpembe is no longer in charge here. I'm the one in charge. And all to find he left for this torch bearer that was going all over the communities. So therefore, we were on our own. It's where then I said, the lives of these workers are in God's hand. The decision has been taken. They are going to kill these workers. Hence, I was kneeling, pleading with them that members, workers, they not even members, workers, because I know how many members of AMCO were there. But the fact of the matter, the decision has been taken. They are going to kill you, these guys. You better move here. Because the life of a black man in Africa is so cheap. They will kill you and replace you. Exactly, they replace with their own wives. I mean, the manner in which he behaves, they haven't done anything. The judge will remember that they were supposed to build about 5,000 houses, if I'm not mistaken. They built almost about 1 or 3. To date, there is no houses that has been built. You go to Nkaneng, there is no water, there is no lights, there is no tar road. It's still a squalor. The workers, communities are living in squalor, but these COOs are raking millions in bonuses. We still have to go for 5-month strike to fight for the better living wage. But to date, I can say to you, AMCO has achieved, there is no worker who goes underground earning less than 13,000 as a basic salary without a benefit. So we've achieved under a very strenuous condition, under a very, pain, on our back. We have to go for 5-month strike to force this come, but the communities are suffering in those areas.
Mr. Matunja, unfortunately, I have to end it there. We have exceeded over our time. Hopefully, we can have both you and Judge Ian Farlam again next year, this time discussing much more of what happened in Marikana, and of course, looking forward to making sure that, as you say, the black Africans of our country are able to go ahead and have the lives that they truly deserve, which is not the case right now at this moment. I'd like to thank my guests, Joseph Matunja from AMCO, and of course, Judge Ian Farlam, who was the chair of the Farlam Commission of Inquiry. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for Truth to Power. Do enjoy the rest of your weekend. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.